Welcome to Instigators of Change, a Khosla Ventures podcast where we take a look at innovative ideas, the people who come up with them, and those who invest in them. I'm Kara Miller, and today we dive into the world of customer relationship management, CRM, and a man who walked away from a multi-billion-dollar company.
And I realized that the support department and the marketing department just have shared nothing in those 10 years that I was operating the company. And I felt like shooting myself in the head. I'm like, wow.
Dheeraj Pandey talks about starting again. But in a world dominated by tech giants, how easy is it to avoid getting stepped on?
Large companies end up gravitating towards richer customers, larger customers. And then disruption really happens from below. I think it's the base of the pyramid that starts to get disrupted.
And Pandey explains what he believes gives you an advantage in building a business.
You know, we've stopped emphasizing reading, writing, and teaching because a lot of creativity is really copying from some other industry or some other realm of life that you bring here. That's also innovation, you know.
That's just ahead on Instigators of Change. In 2009, at a moment of huge economic stress, following a housing collapse and a year in which the stock market was roughly cut in half, Dheeraj Pandey co-founded the cloud computing company Nutanix. By 2013, it was a unicorn worth more than $1 billion. But by 2020, after more than a decade growing Nutanix, Pandey decided, once again, to start from scratch with DevRev, a company hoping to bring software developers and customers closer together.
We are a work management software for developers, product managers, and support engineers, but we feel like if we can really make them come together, and we don't have people who are just passing the baton and that's their... Because we have tons of managers in the middle whose only job is to pass the baton from one department to another.
Pandey notes he has worried about the widespread lack of communication within companies. And what he's hoping to do here is stitch people and tools together so they're actually sharing the information that matters. He says he once saw a video on YouTube, it was from Bain & Company, about what they called founder's mentality, and its message has stayed with him.
And it talks about a paradox that growth creates complexity, and complexity is the silent killer of growth. So what you really vied for is the thing that's going to kill you. And I'm like, that's profound, you know, that's unbelievably profound, you know. And how you really work to simplify is probably the hardest thing in building a business. And it comes to people's calendars and their day-to-day stuff they do. We need to really work hard to simplify. And it takes a lot of energy to simplify. And if we do our job right here at DevRev, we would have done that at least to bring people together, showing them a true north of the end user and the product to say, look, we all work for one, and that's the end user.
But starting a company in the middle of a pandemic, and now 2 years on, in the midst of a lot of economic turbulence, it's not easy. And that is true across the board, almost no matter what sort of business you're in. Though it's also true, the last 2 years have broadened Pandey's way of thinking. Possibilities have opened, and actually the nature of business has kind of changed.
Entrepreneurship is all about the bird in hand principle. It's like you do the best with what you have in your hand as opposed to worry about what you don't have. Also, in other ways, you know, we've realized with COVID and everything else that remote work has become par for the course. So a lot more stuff is happening across the world. The world is flatter all of a sudden in the last 2 years. So we're really looking at this as an opportunity, you know, necessity mothers innovation and invention. So these constraints are making us think in more creative ways than before.
So let me actually sort of draw that out a little bit. How does launching a startup in 2022 differ from starting up Nutanix? Like, how are you different and how does the environment feel different to you?
Yeah, I think the biggest change has been around the commerce side of things, the go-to-market side of things. Last 10 years, the world of software distribution has changed dramatically from when we were shipping code to 20,000 customers across maybe 30,000 sites. And it was a very different velocity of code refresh and maintainability and servicing these accounts and sites and so on. And now all of a sudden there's a few very canonical deployments in the cloud that we control when to upgrade and how to really keep it up and running. So massive change in the last 10 years around how do you really deliver your value rather than giving it to them. You actually take care of all that as well. And that means that the commerce around it has also changed. You're not just having reams and reams of people going and doing the selling and marketing. A lot of it is actually being shifted left into the product, just like it used to be with the retail companies, the e-commerce companies, where there was a website and there was the end user, and then there was some digital marketing along the way. I think B2B is changing dramatically, where a lot of things are actually being shifted to the website, to the product. And I think, there'll be a hybrid version of this for the large enterprises, but I think digital is the name of the game in B2B now, which just didn't exist 10 years ago. In some ways, I think the profile of companies has changed. SaaS, as we all know, is now the way you really build the business model. People worry about new things now, subscription and churn and attrition that we didn't talk about 10, 12 years ago. But in terms of technology, I think what has really changed is the pillar around, obviously, the cloud engineering piece and what it means for compliance and privacy and security. I think that's been a big change. The advent of AI is both an opportunity and a challenge. Because on one hand, you let machines be more intelligent and have them come and recommend and do suggestions and do things that otherwise you need a lot of manual labor for. But in other ways, humans also have to accept these recommendations. So what's the design element of this? There's a yin to the yang of AI, which is design, which I think is a thing that we actually look forward to this decade too.
Let me ask about that a little bit. You talk to different people about AI and you hear different things. Some people feel like it's progressing really quickly in certain kinds of ways. But I also think that there's an argument that, maybe it's progressing quickly in a university, in a lab somewhere, but that doesn't mean that it's being adopted with quite that kind of speed. Tell me just what you see. How quickly do you see things changing?
The last 5 years for sure, because of the compute power of the cloud, there has been a lot of invisible AI that's gone on. And I think the best AI will be invisible. We don't have to really call it AI if it's just a smarter software, a more intelligent machine that's able to predict and be proactive with humans, because their job is to really assist humans in many ways in their business processes and their day-to-day activities. I feel there are fields of AI, like when you look at what it used to be 10 years ago was all about computer vision. Now there's a lot of things around natural language and generative text. And so I think there's a lot more complex AI that people are now really scratching the surface of in the last couple of years. I mean, in our field, for example, when it comes to things like customer support and software engineering, there'll be a need to really elevate people, support engineers and product managers and developers to really go do bigger, better things and leave the repetitive stuff to machines. Mm-hmm. So we see a big opportunity around language, around text processing that just wasn't possible 10 years ago before cloud.
I think that's one of the really interesting questions, the degree to which AI will displace people. And that's also one around which there's a lot of disagreement. But clearly, we see a very low unemployment rate. So far, when I see that, the hiring practices, like over the last couple of years, a lot of big tech companies have added tons of people to their payrolls. So it does feel like, at least so far, as you say, maybe it's just that humans are getting kind of kicked up the ladder. It's not that we don't need them, but the nature of what they do is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the next generation is more attuned to this, that they don't have to do the chores that the previous generation used to do. So in the current generation, there'll be some dislocation, and we saw that with manufacturing in the last 20, 25 years. And there is definitely angst that comes with it. You know, you can see the Midwest belt here, which for all the right reasons complains about lack of reskilling and all the jobs going out of the country. I think some of that will happen in the white-collared world as well. But the next generation, I'm pretty sure, is actually going to be ready for it because they're just being trained differently than the last one.
You have talked about how our attention spans have gotten shorter. That seems on its face right. Without the data behind me, it still seems right. And so you talked about how cycles of creative disruption go more quickly. Explain that to me and what you're seeing. And I mean, I feel like that factors in a lot to this question of what's the space for new companies?
You know, we are moving away from large deals, for example, in the enterprise. We're moving towards shorter contracts with subscription and even shorter metering and billing with consumption. The fact that you only pay for what you use is being metered by the second or the minute, not by a 5-year contract. And that is keeping companies on their toes because now they have to really deliver honest software and value creation that is actually measurable as opposed to what it used to be 5 years ago. I mean, last 3-4 decades of IT have been about, waterfall decisions, big decisions once every 5 years. And I think that's here to stay. Even in the consumer side, we used to have a landline, for decades, 30, 40 years ago. And now we replace phones every year. We used to own music, own songs, whether it was CDs or even on our Apple Music library. And now we just stream it. So I think this is here to stay. And that means that companies have to do a lot more to really retain their customers. And, there's an element of this around engagement and advocacy that is just unprecedented. That's never been heard before this last decade of what we've been thinking around subscription and consumption and everything that comes with renewals and churn and attrition.
And so that sort of churn and attention to the customer, does that make big companies more vulnerable? Because there's also quite interesting academic research that shows big companies are very good at using the technology. They have the money, they have proprietary software to protect themselves from these smaller incumbents.
They choose their comfort zones. Large companies end up gravitating towards richer customers, larger customers, bigger dollars spend. And then disruption really happens from below. I think it's the base of the pyramid that starts to get disrupted. By the way, this is the way religions are formed too. When religions become religions of kings is when new religions emerge for the poor. And that's just as much true for technology as well. So you look at the largest of the large software companies today, they have really, figured out that they can't do a lot of innovation and a lot of high velocity new feature development, new product development, disrupting themselves in the SMB, the startup world, or the mid-market world. So they just gravitate towards the larger customers because these larger customers are just more stable. You can see this in wealth management and just as much that just risk-averse customers that these larger companies tend to gravitate towards. And I think it's just the way any industry evolves.
Can you tell me the story, as you see it, of who your customer is at DevRev and what problem it is that you are trying to solve?
The metaphor that comes to mind is this game of the Chinese telephone where, you say something and then there's 7 layers, 8 layers of people. And then finally, when it reaches someone, it's completely contorted and distorted. And that has been true in IT, in tech for the last several decades now, where what the end user wants and what the makers, which is developers and product managers are trying to do is poles apart. And then you have layers of translation and that just gets lost in the middle. And I think what's required is a collaboration platform where end users support engineers, customer engineers, product managers, developers are all coming together. And, we saw a semblance of this with Slack, but it was all for internal communication and collaboration. To take it to the level where you're able to talk to this at scale with your customers, but also not just in a chat-like fashion, but more in a structured fashion where these things that you're doing are channels, but they have ownership and, SLAs and deadlines and commitment and prioritization and attribution. All those things matter when you're delivering value and we're running a business. So really bringing a lot of this collaboration and bringing it across end users, the internal engineers and the developers and product managers within. That's basically the story of DevRev. And we feel like we need to converge all this stuff together rather than really have divergent departments that only deal with their side of things.
What was it that made you think, yes, there's a company here, like there's a pain point that needs to be addressed? Clearly, now I'm realizing it.
This epiphany came to me in my last company. We were spending almost $1 billion a year on sales and marketing to get to $1.6 billion, $1.7 billion in annual revenue. Almost $250 million of that was marketing. And I was sitting in a meeting and I was like, we were building new products and we wanted to really send this promotional email to our end users. And I realized that the support department and the marketing department just have shared nothing in those 10 years that I was operating the company. And I felt like shooting myself in the head. I'm like, wow.
They shared nothing with each other.
On the contact information and end users.
Got it.
And I'm like, wow, like, what does this mean? Like, we've run this business. We've made like $6-7 billion in lifetime revenue. We have such large customers and we just don't know how to market to our end users. There's no marketing workflow that really sends things to end users. And that's when this idea that, look, we have really compartmentalized companies into departments, So if you look at any tech company, they build software, they operate their business,
right?
The cloud, and then they go and support their customers and they grow their business. So build, operate, support, and grow. And they all have their own tools, but nobody knows the end user. Nobody knows what they use, what they don't use. And there are tools galore that try to give this little bit of information to a product manager. There are tools for support that developers can't log on to. There's tools for developers that support can't log on to. There's tools for growth engineers that no one else can really have access to. And it basically was because the way we really went about doing this was more physics. And now there's a need for chemistry where everything is coming together because the end user has a very short attention span. So they need to be retained, they need to be delighted, they need to be engaged, and they are the epicenter of all things business. So this is why we feel like CRMs were built for departments like sales CRM and marketing CRM and support CRM. And now this dev CRM is really an integration. It's the chemistry of all of this together because what really matters is the end user and the product.
I know that DevRev does stuff with Slack and it does stuff with email. And I remember a couple of years ago talking to Cal Newport, who has written very compelling stuff about being able to focus and about the distraction of email. And it just occurred to me that, one of the trickiest things for people in doing their job, as you know, is you've got all these bits of communication coming at you at the same time. You're probably trying to focus on something else, but you've got email that you're checking every few minutes and Slack is more instant and you got people filing tickets. It feels like if you were trying to design a day, it's a day currently that's just been designed in this crazy, insane way that doesn't maximize what people should get done.
No, you're right. I mean, we are on a treadmill right now, and with remote work and Zoom meetings, it's probably even getting worse because you don't have the luxury of, just wandering, letting your mind wander a bit or do creative things. And that's why developers complain about deep work and what flow means to them. And I'm sure most creatives do it, not just developers, designers and product managers. Every creative actually bemoans the loss of deep work. And I think this is where machines need to come in. Speaking of AI, we're not there yet because there's still a lot of English in our business transactions, and that needs to be processed. And natural language processing is still, our customers tell us, like, please tell us what's trending, what's heating up. What do we really need to build? And all of that is in English. So I think we are upon some things this decade where machines will have to help, but I think we're barely scratching the surface. The first thing we need to do is make it delightful, make it inexpensive, make it accessible, democratize all data to everybody so that you get rid of the politics that today exists because only a few have access to information. And then information is power, and power brings politics and control and everything else. So if we can democratize things, we can reduce the burden of proof on people. I think it's the first step. And then machines will have to kick in because there's so much data, there's so many customers, and there's such little time.
So obviously you are marketing to businesses, but those businesses have at the end of the road there, they have individual clients. What do you think you've learned about how the consumer has changed in the last, say, decade? Do you feel like there's been big shifts that are notable to you?
The biggest one, we've given it a very analyst speak. We call it PLG, or product-led growth. But the biggest change is top-down decision-making in IT, which we call the buyer. The buyer used to push things down because it was a buy and try phenomenon. Buy first and then we'll try it and we'll see if we bought shelfware.
Okay.
Now it's really grassroots up. So it's try, then buy. And the decision is really moved to the doers, to the technologists, to the individual, to the consumer. And we've given it a fancy name called product-led growth. But the idea is consumer-grade thinking in the enterprise. And how do you really go delight the end user first and build this army of people that then your salespeople can go and say, look, your army of people love us already. So let's talk about formalizing this whole thing.
So you're talking like product managers, engineers, whoever, they're saying like, we should try this thing. It's great.
Yeah. And because, products are not as heavyweight, you don't have to commit to $1 million and do a proof of concept for 9 months or a pilot for that long because you're not shipping hardware. It's not a thing like that. It's basically something that you can try and there's the freemium model, which, you can take credits and work on that for a few months and you can swipe a credit card. All the things we did with retail and e-commerce are actually coming true in B2B as well.
Let's talk for a minute about problem solving, because whether you're doing a startup or you're in the middle of a company somewhere near the top or near to the bottom, just give me a sense of qualities that you think, if you are thinking about yourself, either getting a company launched or, pushing things to the next level. What are qualities, and this may be, through like hard-won experience, but that you feel like are really important that we don't give enough credit to?
We've stopped emphasizing reading, writing, and teaching in a business setup. Very few people do deep reading or even just good reading because a lot of creativity is really copying from some other industry or some other realm of life that you bring here. That's also innovation, And we have stopped reading in our business lives. We have stopped writing, by the way. I love this new thing called Notion that helps you organize your thinking. And because they've done it very beautifully, you can now get rid of some of the writer's blocks as well. But reading, writing, and finally teaching, I think, we are going younger and younger in demographics, even in tech and engineering. And you need to really, when you teach is when you learn the most as well. So I feel like these three qualities have been lost in B2B and just in company building, business building at large. And then the things that we don't really give enough sort of, credence to are breathing, sleeping, and smiling, like how do you, because, it's such a difficult thing. You're waging a war against incumbency, in a underserved market. And the thing that will really keep you going is your emotional balance, because, there'll be daily highs and lows. You lose people, you gain people, you lose customers, you'll gain customers. There'll be all sorts of things happening on a daily basis. You have a family, you have to come and figure out, how to just have peace at home and be happy at home. All this stuff is so paradoxical. The only thing that you can do is to figure out how to be emotionally balanced. And for that, at least I try to, even in meetings, when I could blow my top off, I'm like, okay, how do I breathe more? And how do I, obviously sleeping helps too. It's a great healing process for most entrepreneurs and even just people working for smaller startups. And finally, I think, smiling, it just, releases hormones that will be good in meetings too,
It's so funny. Two follow-ups. One is we were talking not that long ago to Ethan Mollick, a professor at Wharton at UPenn and a real guru on research around startups. And boy, when I asked him a similar question, like what can startup founders do to gain an edge? Sleep was a major answer. And he just said people tend to value, people who don't get any sleep. But that's exactly the opposite. You have better ideas. You're more able to discern between good ideas and bad ideas when you've had enough sleep. So it's so interesting to hear you say that.
No, I'm a big fan of Matt Walker as well. Why We Sleep.
Yeah.
And also James Nestor, he wrote a really good book on breathing. And I feel like these are the kind of things that become your competitive advantage when you're really waging a war.
And then I want to come back to the reading and writing and teaching piece of it. I often wonder actually about what you said, which is the idea of even young people who have access to YouTube or have phones, but certainly older people too. We've become very reactive instead of saying like, here's a book and I'm going to go actually find out information. We're mostly waiting for information like a tweet comes and do we like it or do we not? And there's a Facebook post. What do we think of it? And so there's a lot of sort of waiting for people to throw things at us every few seconds instead of deep thinking. So it's interesting to me. I wonder if you think people have a competitive advantage who are actually able to stop and say, no, I'm going to spend an hour reading this smart person's book.
I speak about this to our children just as much, especially our 12-year-old son, about how he's just consuming. All he does is consume. I'm like, so if you're consuming, somebody's producing and creating. Why don't you become that creator?
Right.
And I think those who create, we give them fancy names like influencers or whatever, but there's something to be said about people who create and produce. And, we definitely need to get our children to start to think about that because consuming has become so easy and so inexpensive and so addictive,
Yes.
When you think about scrolling on a TikTok sort of app for like hours on end. We need to get out of this dopamine world into a more oxytocin and endorphin world as well,
A final question for you, which is, how are you different? I guess this is a two-part. How are you a different person than when you had a startup last time? And how scary is it to start a company again?
When I was starting Nutanix, we didn't have any children. And I asked my cousin, should I postpone having a family because I'm starting something from scratch? This is 2009. And I think the best advice he gave me was that if you are a good father, you'll be a good entrepreneur. And that stuck with me, and ever since, I think we've had 3 children and I've been more patient. I breathe more in front of them because I need to be invoking all the patience I need. I feel like I know more now than I did back then. So in many ways, I'm more knowledgeable, which makes me a little bit more paranoid now than I was in my first time. First time, we just kept raising money once a year. We didn't have that forethought of what about, the runway for 2-3 years. We just kept building and building and building, and it was just looking forward. This time around, I work backwards from things a lot more than I did the last time. And that makes me optimistic. That at the same time, it makes me more paranoid, because I know more than the last time. And, that's a timeless journey for any entrepreneur. So I'm enjoying it to the hilt. I'm learning to do even more work on design and consumers and delight than in my last company, but I couldn't have asked for more.
And you're reading, which is important.
Oh, yeah. And the reading on biology as well. I mean, just learning so much since COVID, we've learned so much on what the environment around us could do to us. So I'm just beginning to understand things around biology, which is just so profound. And not that I could have done a company, because I just don't know enough. But to read on the sidelines and to invest from the sidelines has been fulfilling.
Dheeraj Pandey is CEO at DevRev. He's also an investor and was the co-founder of Nutanix. Dheeraj, thanks so much. This is great.
Thank you so much, Kara.
And thanks, as always, to you for joining us. If you want to hear that Ethan Mollick interview that I referenced about sleep and entrepreneurship and these kind of business myths that often impair our ability to succeed, you can find it at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Kara Miller. Our show is produced by Matt Purdy.